Earth remained silent until the Galactic Council's final insult crossed the line. They called us observers. That word should have felt like an insult, and maybe it was meant to be one. But 11 years in that gallery taught me something the Council never understood about human beings. We do not need to be invited to the table to learn everything happening at it. My name is Owen Calloway. I was 34 years old when the Terran Compact assigned me to the Galactic Council station at Vithara Prime, a rotating disk of metal and light the size of a small city, hanging in the gravitational shadow of a blue giant star. My title was Senior Observer, Terran Delegation. My actual job, the one nobody wrote down anywhere, was to sit in a glass gallery above the council floor and watch, and remember, and say absolutely nothing. I had been doing it for 11 years when everything changed. The gallery where human observers sat was on the 4th tier, behind a transparent barrier that the council species called the Clarity Screen. It was a polite name for what it actually was, a wall that kept lesser species separated from the proceedings below. We could see everything. We could hear everything. We could not speak, vote, or interrupt. We were there officially so that pre-integration species could learn the customs of galactic civilization before being formally considered for membership. Unofficially, we were furniture. There were 4 of us in the Terran gallery at any given time. Myself, a communications analyst named Paula Wren, who had the sharpest memory of anyone I had ever met, a young engineer named Colin Fitch who spent most sessions running quiet calculations on a handheld device, and our cultural liaison, a quiet woman named Grace Alderton who had spent 20 years studying the body language and social hierarchies of every council species before she ever set foot on Vithara Prime. Between the 4 of us, we missed nothing. Below us, the council floor was a marvel of deliberate intimidation. The chamber was enormous, shaped like the inside of a shell, curving upward in tiers of polished stone. 31 species held seats on the floor. The most powerful sat at the center ring. The less powerful sat in the outer rings. The arrangement was not random. It was a daily, visual reminder of exactly where everyone stood. At the very center sat Grand Arbiter Velsarath. He was tall, scaled in deep gray, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line across his broad face. His species, the Vithari, had held the position of Grand Arbiter for 200 years. He wore that fact like armor. Every time he moved, every time he spoke, there was a slowness to it, a deliberate wait, as though the universe itself was expected to wait for him. I had watched Velsarath for 11 years. I knew the exact angle at which he tilted his head when he had already decided something, and was simply allowing others to finish speaking. I knew the particular stillness that came over him when something surprised him, a stillness so complete that even his secondary eyelids stopped blinking. I knew which of his advisors he actually listened to, and which ones he kept around for appearances. He did not know my name. That was fine. That was in fact the point. The session I want to tell you about began like any other. Paula was already in her seat when I arrived, a cup of nutrient broth in her hand and a calm, attentive look on her face. Colin was running numbers on something. Grace was watching the floor delegates settle into their chairs with the focused expression of someone reading a book only she could see. "Anything interesting on the agenda?" I asked, settling into my chair and pulling up the session brief on my tablet. "Resource allocation dispute between the Kavari and the Drenoth Collective," Paula said, without looking up. "And there's a new lesser species assessment being tabled. I checked the registry this morning." I looked at her. "Hours." "Hours," she said. I set the tablet down and looked at the floor below. The lesser species assessments were routine documents. Every few years, the Council's intelligence arm, a body called the Continuity Secretariat, would compile a report on each pre-integration civilization, rating it on a standardized scale across military capacity, industrial output, cultural cohesion, and what they called projection capability, which meant the ability to extend influence or force beyond your home system. Earth's last assessment had rated us as follows: negligible military capacity, moderate industrial output, stable cultural cohesion, zero projection capability. The summary line had read, species of limited galactic relevance, agricultural and early industrial classification, no intervention required. I had read that document 3 times. I had sent a copy home to the Compact's strategic planning office with a single annotation in the margin. They believe this. The session began. Velsareth opened proceedings with the standard recitation of council priorities, a list of resolutions currently in motion, pending disputes, and new business. His voice filled the chamber without effort, deep and resonant, the kind of voice that expected silence in response. The resource dispute between the Kavari and the Drenoth Collective went first. I watched it carefully, not because the outcome mattered to Earth, but because the Kavari ambassador, a delegate named Drenek, was one of the few council members I would have described as honest. His species were insectoid, tall and narrow-bodied, with delicate antennae that expressed emotion in ways their faces could not. Drenek's antennae were low and pressed flat as he argued his case, which meant he was frustrated but controlled. I had learned to read him well. The dispute was settled in the Drenoth Collective's favor, as most disputes were settled in favor of whoever had more ships parked in the nearest system. Drenek accepted the outcome with a small formal bow. His antennae did not move at all. That meant something different. That meant he had expected nothing else. Then came Earth's assessment. A council clerk read it aloud. It was almost identical to the previous one. Negligible threat, no projection capability, agricultural and industrial classification. The updated summary line had one small addition. Species demonstrates consistent cooperative behavior and poses no challenge to council order. Continued observer status recommended. Below me, a delegate from one of the Outer Ring species, a heavy, barrel-chested creature whose name I had never bothered to memorize because he had never said anything worth remembering, made a sound that his translation collar rendered as a low chuckle. A few others responded similarly. Nothing loud, nothing formal, just a small, shared moment of amusement at the idea that anyone had taken the time to write that document at all. Paula took a slow sip of her broth. Grace did not look up from the floor. Colin continued running his numbers. I looked at the document summary on my tablet. I looked at the negligible threat line. Then I looked at what I knew to be true. I thought about the 17 shipyards currently operating in the asteroid belt around Jupiter, all listed in the Compact's civilian infrastructure budget as deep space construction and maintenance facilities. I thought about the 312 research stations scattered across the outer planets, all of them quietly doing work that the Council's Continuity Secretariat had no data on. I thought about the colonists on 6 worlds beyond the solar system, all of them living in habitats disguised from long-range sensors as uninhabited geological formations. I thought about 40 years of patient, deliberate, invisible work. Then I closed the document, set my tablet face down on my knee, and looked at the ceiling of the gallery for a moment. "That's a lovely report," I said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Grace, without turning her head, allowed herself a very small smile. After the session, I stayed in the gallery as the floor cleared. It was a habit. The chamber felt different when it was empty, less like a seat of power, and more like what it actually was, a very large, very old room full of chairs. I often thought better in it when it was empty. Drenek found me there, which was not unusual. He had a habit of coming to the gallery observation deck after difficult sessions. He moved quietly for someone his size, and he always stood a respectful distance away before speaking. It was one of the things I appreciated about him. "They gave you the same rating as last cycle," he said. It was not quite a question. "Negligible threat," I confirmed. "Same as always." Drenek's antennae moved in a slow, curling pattern that I had come to understand meant something close to unease. "My people have a word," he said. "Vashil." It describes the quality of silence before something large moves, the way the forest goes quiet before a landslide begins. He paused. I have been thinking of that word often when I watch your delegation. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked back at the empty chamber below. That's a good word, I said. He waited in case I would say more. I did not. After a moment, he gave the small formal bow that was his people's version of a farewell and left. I sat there alone for another hour. Below me, the cleaning drones were already moving between the chairs, polishing the floor back to its original shine. Everything was being made ready for the next session, the next round of business, the next set of decisions made by the powerful about the less powerful. I had a report to file. I picked up my tablet and began writing. The report was, as always, thorough and detailed. Names, arguments, outcomes, alliances observed, tensions noted. It went into a file that was transmitted home on a tight beam channel, encrypted in a format that the Council's Signals Division had been trying to crack for 6 years without success. At the bottom of the report, I added a personal observation, as I sometimes did when something struck me as important. It was short. They are comfortable, I wrote. Comfortable entities stop paying attention, and entities that stop paying attention stop being able to correctly count the things around them. They have now officially miscounted us twice. I recommend patience continues for now. I sent the report, stood up, stretched my back and walked out of the empty gallery. Behind me, the chamber lights dimmed automatically, one section at a time, until the whole vast room was dark. It had been a quiet day. Most of our days were. The first time the council took something from us, we paid the fine and said nothing. They called it a continuity tithe. The official documentation, 47 pages of dense procedural language, described it as a mandatory contribution from all observer-class civilizations to a central fund that maintained galactic stability. The word mandatory appeared 11 times in those 47 pages. The word voluntary did not appear at all. The amount assessed for Earth was significant. A transfer of refined minerals, processed fuel compounds, and biological data from 6 categories of Terran flora and fauna. Paula read the notification first. She came to my quarters at 6 in the morning, set the document on my desk, and stood back with her arms folded. They sent this at midnight station time, she said. Response window is 30 days. I read it once through. Then I read the payment schedule. Then I looked at the section near the back titled Consequences of Noncompliance, which described a range of responses from trade restriction to what was listed, without any apparent discomfort, as administrative corrective engagement. That phrase meant ships. Send the compliance form, I said. Standard acknowledgement, no additional remarks. Paula held my gaze for a moment. No objection filed. No objection filed. She picked up the document. Understood. She paused at the door. This is the 3rd cycle running that they've raised the assessed amount. I know, I said. She left. I sat at my desk and looked at the wall for a while. Downstairs, I had a session to attend in 2 hours. I showered, dressed, ate something I didn't taste, and went to do my job. The session that day was unremarkable except for one small moment that I noted carefully. A delegate from the Unworthy Confederation, a species of medium power and moderate ambition, stood during open proceedings and asked the council floor a question. He asked whether the tithe assessment process was reviewed by an independent body or whether it was set solely by the Continuity Secretariat, which was itself appointed by the Grand Arbiter's office. The question was polite, it was relevant, it was a fair thing to ask. Velsareth let the silence stretch for a long beat before responding. Then he said simply that the Secretariat operated under a review charter that had been ratified 200 years ago, and that the Unworthy delegate was welcome to consult the full charter text if he had concerns. The Unworthy delegate sat down. He did not consult the charter text, or if he did, he never raised the subject again. That evening, Drenek found me in the gallery again. He seemed to make a habit of it on difficult days. He didn't mention the tithe, but his antennae were doing the flat-pressing thing again, which told me he was thinking about it. "The Unworthy delegate asked a good question today," I said. "Yes," Drenek agreed, "he did. It will not be asked again." "No," Drenek said, "it will not." We stood there for a moment, watching the cleaning drones below. "How long has your world been sending people here?" he asked. 31 years, I said. "I'm the fourth lead observer." "And in 31 years," he said carefully, "your world has never formally objected to anything. Not the tithe, not the territorial reclassifications, not the seeding protocols. Nothing." "That's correct." His antennae moved in a long, slow arc. "My people find that difficult to interpret." I looked at him. "What are the two most common interpretations?" He considered. "Either you are very afraid," he said, "or you are very certain." I nodded slowly. "Those are the two options, yes." He waited. I did not clarify which one applied. He gave his small formal bow and left. I stayed a while longer. It was 6 weeks after the tithe notification that the second thing happened, and this one was harder to absorb quietly. I received a formal document from the Council's territorial registry, routed through the Observer Administration desk, stamped with the Secretariat's seal. It informed me that the human colony on the world we called Kepler 62F, a settlement of 11,000 people that had existed for 18 years, growing food, raising families, building a small and careful life on a green world 3,000 light-years from Earth, had been administratively reclassified. The planet was now designated a Kavari protectorate. Our colonists were still permitted to remain. They were simply no longer on a human world. They were on a Kavari world, and as residents of a protectorate territory, they were now subject to Kavari administrative law, which meant licensing fees for land use, transmission taxes for communications with Earth, and a requirement to register all births, deaths, and significant property changes with the Kavari Regional Authority. The reclassification fine, the administrative fee for formally processing the change, was listed at the bottom of the document. It was payable by Earth within 90 days. I read the document standing up at my desk. I read it twice. Then I set it down, walked to the window of my quarters and looked out at the station's outer ring, where cargo ships were moving in slow, orderly lines, carrying goods between species, maintaining the commerce that kept the Council's peace. 11,000 people, on a world they had built with their own hands. I thought about the message I would have to send home, not the official compliance acknowledgement. That would be handled through proper channels as always. The personal one, to Director Yates at the Compact's Planning Division, the one who understood what these reports actually meant. I thought about how to word it. In the end, I sent the compliance form that day, standard acknowledgement, no objection filed. Then I sent the personal message to Director Yates, and I allowed myself, in that message, a single sentence that was not procedural in nature, a single sentence that I had not written in 11 years of reports. The colony at Kepler 62F has been reclassified without consent, and the fine has been assessed, and I believe we are approaching the kind of action that, once taken, cannot be undone by any amount of documentation. Director Yates replied within 12 hours, one word. Noted. That was enough. The social events were, in some ways, harder than the sessions. At least in the sessions, there were rules of procedure. There was a structure. People were expected to behave in certain formal ways, and when they did not, it was at least a clear violation of a known standard. The banquets had no such protection. The Council hosted formal dinners every 2 months, rotating through the cuisines and customs of member species. Observer delegations were invited. It was described as a gesture of inclusion. In practice, it meant sitting at the outer tables with the other pre-integration representatives, while the main floor species gathered in the center of the room under the best lighting. I attended because it was my job to attend. Paula attended because she never missed anything. Colin usually found an excuse. Grace attended and spent the entire time reading the room with that focused, quiet attention that was her particular gift. It was at one of these banquets, about 3 months after the Kepler 62F reclassification, that the incident happened. I am going to describe it plainly, without drama, because the drama was not in the moment itself. The drama was in my response to it, or rather, in the complete absence of one. A delegate from one of the inner-ring species, I will not name them because it does not matter, and because the individual involved was not acting alone in spirit, only in action, had consumed several servings of whatever fermented compound his species favored for celebration. He was loud. He was moving between tables. He was telling stories. He stopped at the outer tables. He looked at the 4 of us. Then, with great theatrical flair, he began doing an impression of what he apparently believed humans looked like when they received bad news. It involved hunched shoulders, a slack expression, and a pantomime of accepting a document with trembling hands. His companions laughed. A few delegates nearby looked over and smiled. One looked away. I watched the performance. I did not move. I did not change my expression. I did not stand or speak or react in any way that could be observed, measured, or recorded. Grace, beside me, was looking at a point slightly above the delegate's head, as though something mildly interesting was happening on the ceiling. Paula took a sip of her water. The delegate finished his performance, gave a small bow to his audience, and moved on. After a moment, Grace said, quietly, "The inner-ring delegate from the Sorvith Assembly, 3rd seat. He sits directly behind Councillor Maresh." "I know," I said. "Maresh was watching," Grace said. "Not laughing, watching." "I know that too," I said. I filed it in the same place I filed everything. The same place I had been filing things for 11 years. The night before the Heritage Reserve resolution came to a vote, I could not sleep. That was unusual. I had trained myself over a long career to sleep when sleep was available, regardless of what was happening. It was a practical discipline. But that night I lay awake in my quarters, staring at the ceiling, thinking about 11,000 people on a green world, and all the other people on all the other places that decisions like this touched. The resolution had been proposed by Councillor Maresh 6 weeks earlier. It was, technically, an environmental protection measure. The Council's Continuity Secretariat had determined that certain regions of the galaxy were of significant historical and ecological value and should be preserved under Council authority as heritage reserves. It was presented as conservation. It was presented as responsible governance. The solar system of the star called Sol, Earth's Sun, had been designated as Reserve Candidate 7. Under the terms of the resolution, if passed, the solar system would be placed under Council authority as a protected heritage zone. Human activity within the system would be permitted, but subject to Council regulation and oversight. The Terran Compact would retain no sovereignty over its own home system. Earth would, in legal terms, become a managed territory. The resolution had 31 signatories. It was expected to pass unanimously. I lay in the dark and I thought about Drennick's word, Vashil, the stillness before a landslide. Then I thought about something else. I thought about 40 years of decisions made quietly by people I would never meet. People who had looked at the galaxy and said, "We are going to do this differently. We are not going to announce ourselves until we know what we are walking into. We are going to watch and learn and prepare and wait." I thought about the shipyards. I thought about the research stations. I thought about the 312 quiet installations on the outer planets, each one doing its particular piece of a very large and very patient project. I thought about what I had been authorized to endure. That list was long. It included humiliations, unjust assessments, territorial violations, financial extractions, and social dismissals. It was a list built on a foundation of strategy, not weakness. Every item on that list had been endured because the people who built the list understood something important. That walking into this room too soon, with too little, would end the same way for Earth as it had ended for every other smaller species that had tried to speak up before they were ready. The list did not include the end of Earth's sovereignty over Earth. That was not on the list. The vote was held the following morning. The chamber was full. All 31 council members were present. Observer delegations were in their galleries. The resolution was read aloud in full. It took 20 minutes, and then Velsareth called the vote. The result came in blocks, species by species. The numbers climbed, 23 in favor, 27, 30. The final tally was 31-0 in favor. Earth's delegation abstained, as always. The abstention was noted in the record without comment. I watched the vote counter on my tablet reach its final number. I watched Velsareth acknowledge the result with a slow, deliberate nod. I watched the chamber settle into the quiet satisfaction of a decided matter. Then I picked up my personal communicator. I opened a channel to Director Yates at the Compact Planning Division. I typed 3 words. I looked at them for a moment. Then I sent them. The 3 words were, "The lines moved." I set the communicator down on my knee and looked at the ceiling of the gallery, and I breathed slowly, and I waited. Below me, Velsareth was already moving on to the next item of business. He had no idea what he had just done. 72 hours. That is how long it took. 72 hours from the moment I sent those 3 words to the moment the Council's long-range sensor network began registering contacts it could not explain. I was in my quarters when the first reports started moving through the station's information channels. I was drinking coffee, real coffee, from beans grown on a Terran colony world, one of the small shipments that arrived with the quarterly supply run, and reading through the previous session's transcript when my handheld lit up with a notification flagged urgent from the station's Continuity Secretariat Monitoring Office. It was a simple alert. Unidentified contacts, multiple, across 17 star systems. Vessels of unknown classification, not matching any registered profile in the Council's ship registry. 17 systems at once. I set my coffee down. Paula was at my door 11 minutes later. She had the same alert on her own device, and she was wearing the expression she always wore when something significant was happening. Not excited, not alarmed, just very, very focused. 17 systems, she said. I counted, I said. The number's gone up, she said. It's 63 now, as of 4 minutes ago. I stood up and got my jacket. By the time we reached the gallery, the council floor below was no longer operating in any kind of normal order. Delegates were standing at their seats. Communication devices were active on every console. Velsareth was at the center of the chamber, not seated, standing, with 4 advisors close around him, speaking quickly in low voices. The final number when the sensor sweeps completed was 409. 409 vessels, spread across more than 400 star systems, all of them dropping the sensor profiles they had maintained for between 8 and 22 years. All of them going from invisible to visible within the same 6-hour window. They were not small ships. I stood in the gallery and watched the chamber below dissolve into something I had never seen before in 11 years. Not panic. Not quite, but something that sits very close to panic, a sudden, jarring collision between what a group of powerful people believed to be true and what was demonstrably, visually, undeniably in front of them. Grace leaned close to me and said, very quietly, "Maresh is looking at the gallery." I did not look at Maresh. I kept my eyes on Velsoreth. The Grand Arbiter was still, the absolute, total stillness I had learned to recognize as the outer edge of his composure. Every secondary eyelid was closed. His advisors were still talking, but he was not listening to them anymore. He was thinking. It took him 40 minutes to call an emergency session. That was fast, by council standards. The chamber assembled in full. The sensor data was presented by the Continuity Secretariat's chief analyst, a narrow-bodied species whose name translated roughly as the one who measures. She presented the data with the careful, neutral tone of a professional delivering information she herself found deeply uncomfortable. 409 vessels. Average mass, 3 times the tonnage of the Council's heavy cruiser classification. Crew profiles, Terran biological signatures confirmed. Armament, unknown. Drive systems, unknown. Configuration, unlike anything in the Council's database. And then, because the Secretariat was thorough even when the results of their thoroughness were embarrassing, she presented the accompanying data. The orbital installations, the colony habitats, the research facilities, the entire network of what had been hidden for decades behind the label of civilian infrastructure. She presented Earth's actual census numbers, which were significantly higher than the Council's estimated figures. She presented the communication infrastructure, a relay network spanning a third of explored space, built into the natural geography of asteroid fields and gas giant rings, virtually undetectable without knowing exactly where to look. When she finished, the chamber was very quiet. Velsoreth looked up at the gallery. I was already looking at him. We held that look for a moment. It was not a challenging look on my part. It was simply a steady one. The look of someone who has been waiting a long time and is now, without any particular satisfaction, done waiting. Then I watched him do something I had never seen him do in 11 years. He looked away first. The formal communiqué from the Terran Compact arrived at the Council's official communications office 14 minutes into that silence. It was delivered on every Council frequency simultaneously, in all 31 languages spoken by member species, translated without error. The station's communication system flagged it as a priority alpha message, the highest category, reserved for events of galactic significance. The document was 7 pages long. It was precise, calm, and complete. It opened with a formal identification. The Terran Compact, acting on behalf of the human species, hereby registered its transition from observer status to sovereign compact status, effective immediately. Attached to the notification was a revised territorial map, identifying Terran-claimed space, Terran-protected space, and the boundaries of the Terran Compact's defensive perimeter. The territory was considerably larger than the Council had believed humans occupied. Attached was a full capability disclosure, classified by vessel type, installation category, and approximate personnel strength. It was not, the document noted, a complete disclosure. It was enough to establish the relevant facts. Attached was a counter-resolution. It was 1 page. It addressed, in clear and direct language, the Heritage Reserve resolution that had passed 31-0 3 days earlier. It stated that the solar system designated Sol and all territory within the defined Terran perimeter was not subject to Council Heritage Reserve designation, had never been subject to it, and would not be subject to it. It stated further that the Terran Compact did not recognize the legal basis of the resolution and considered it to be without effect. The counter-resolution did not use angry language. It did not use any emotional language at all. It was simply a set of statements about reality, written as precisely as an engineering specification. I was still in the gallery when the document was received. The entire floor had access to it on their consoles within moments. I watched delegates read it. I watched the reading happen in waves, the initial scan, the pause, the second, more careful read, the moment when the eyes went slightly still. Velsoreth read it without any visible change in his expression. That was, I thought, a kind of courage. Then he looked up at the gallery again. I stood up. I had not stood up in a council session in 11 years. Paula stood with me. Then Grace. Then Colin, setting his handheld aside with a quiet click. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my observer identification badge. It was a small rectangle of composite material, embossed with the council's seal and the words Terran Delegation, Observer Class in 6 languages. I placed it gently on the gallery railing. And then, for the first time in 11 years, I spoke in the council chamber. Not loud. I did not need to be loud. The chamber had gone quiet enough that a normal voice carried. "We are patient," I said, "but we do not forget." Then I turned and walked out of the gallery, and Paula, Grace, and Colin came with me, and I did not look back. Behind me, 11 years of silence closed like a door. Colin had already begun pulling data from the council's own sensor network by the time we reached the corridor. He had been doing this for 6 years. A quiet feed he had established through a routine observer access port that no one had thought to restrict, because no one had thought an observer would ever have a reason to use it for anything important. Now it was feeding him real-time position data on every vessel currently docked or approaching within sensor range. He showed me the numbers on his handheld as we walked. "They have 14 ships docked at the station," he said. "None of them are armed beyond standard patrol configuration." "Good," I said. "They also have about 40 people trying to contact the Terran delegation's communication address right now," he added. "All of them from council member delegations." "Which ones?" He scrolled through the list. "Mostly outer ring, 2 inner ring, 1 from the Grand Arbiter's office." I stopped walking. Paula stopped beside me. I looked at the list. The message from the Grand Arbiter's office was not from Velsoreth himself. It was from a junior attaché, which told me something important. Velsoreth had not yet decided what he wanted to say to us, but he needed to appear as though he was already engaging. The message from the junior attaché was a request to schedule a meeting at the earliest convenience of the Terran delegation. I handed the handheld back to Colin. "Tell the outer ring delegations we will be available for consultations beginning tomorrow morning. Tell the inner ring delegations we will schedule them in the coming days. Tell the Grand Arbiter's attaché that the first speaker looks forward to a direct conversation with the Grand Arbiter at his earliest convenience." Colin looked at me. "Not the attaché, the Arbiter himself." "Not the attaché," I confirmed. "The Arbiter." We continued walking. Grace had been quiet since we left the gallery, which was unusual only in that she was usually cataloging things aloud in moments of high information density. I looked at her. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I'm thinking about the ones who didn't message," she said. "The ones who are still sitting in their offices right now, not reaching out, not responding, calculating." She paused. "Maresh hasn't sent anything." "No," I said. "He's the most dangerous right now," she said. "Not because he has power, but because he has plans that are no longer going to work, and people who have failed plans become unpredictable." I nodded. "Keep watching him." "I already am," she said. Back in my quarters, I allowed myself 15 minutes of something I had not done in 11 years of observer service. I sat on the edge of my bed and I did nothing. No report to file. No data to review. No session transcript to annotate. Just 15 minutes of sitting with the weight of what had happened and letting it be real. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and went back to work. The first practical consequence I dealt with was the station's protocol office. They needed to reclassify the Terran delegation's administrative status from observer to sovereign, update our security clearances, reassign our gallery space, and issue new credentials to the 4 of us. This was, in theory, a straightforward administrative process. In practice, It required 4 separate approval chains, 2 of which ran through departments headed by people who had spent 2 centuries deciding that this kind of transition would never need to happen. The processing clerk who handled our case was a young being, relatively junior, from a species with no particular stake in the outcome. She worked through the forms methodically, without apparent opinion about what she was doing. I appreciated that. When she came to the section asking for the delegation's voting weight, she paused. "This hasn't been calculated yet under the new formula," she said. "The structural reform resolution hasn't passed." "It will," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she put in a placeholder and moved on. We had new credentials by the following morning. The observer placard on the gallery door was replaced. The transit restrictions on our communication channels were removed. The 4 of us now had floor access to the council chamber at any time of day or night. Paula walked onto the chamber floor that evening when it was empty and stood in the center of it. I watched her from the doorway. She turned in a slow circle, looking up at the tiers, at the seats, at the central display that was dark and quiet without a session in progress. 11 years looking down at this floor, she said. Yes, I said. She turned and looked at me. It's smaller than it looks from the gallery. Everything is, I said. She nodded once, then walked back toward the door. On her way past me, she said, I'm going to write a very good report tonight. I know you are, I said. What came next was not a war. I want to be clear about that. There were no battles, no planets burned, no fleets exchanged fire. What came next was something quieter than that, and in some ways more decisive. Earth did not attack. Earth simply stopped complying. The first thing that happened was the trade routes. 4 major council supply corridors ran through what the new Terran territorial map had designated as compact space. They had been running through that space for decades, uncontested, because no one had thought to contest them. Earth sent formal notifications to the relevant shipping authorities. These corridors now required compact transit authorization. Applications for authorization were available through the Terran Compact's newly established Diplomatic Affairs Office. The applications required documentation, review, and processing time. The processing time was 6 weeks. 14 commercial shipping operations, carrying goods to and from 11 council member species, found themselves rerouted around Terran space at considerable additional distance and cost. No ships were stopped. No cargo was seized. The routes were simply unavailable without proper authorization, which was being processed in an orderly fashion. The second thing was the colonies. The colony at Kepler 62F received a new document from the Terran Compact's legal office. It informed the 11,000 residents that their administrative status had been corrected. They were residents of a Terran Compact colony. Kavari administrative law no longer applied to them. The licensing fees, transmission taxes, and registration requirements were suspended immediately, pending a formal review of the reclassification that had created them. A copy of this document was delivered to the Kavari delegation on Vethara Prime. Drenek received it at his desk. He read it twice. Then he set it down and his antennae moved in a pattern I had never seen before from him. It took me a moment to identify it. It was relief. You're going to cause enormous difficulty, he told me, when we met in the gallery observation deck that evening. We're going to cause some short-term administrative complexity, I said. That's different from difficulty. He looked at me for a long time. Is it? Difficulty, I said, is what you have when someone does something to you that you can't answer. Administrative complexity is what you have when the rules of the game are being rewritten in front of you, and you have to decide whether to keep playing by the old ones. Drenek was quiet for a moment. And if the council decides to enforce the old rules by force, then we'll have a different conversation, I said, but I don't think they will. Why not? I thought about the 409 ships. I thought about the capability disclosure attached to the communique. I thought about everything that had not been included in that disclosure, which was quite a lot. Because they're not certain what the answer looks like, I said, and powerful entities are very rarely willing to start a conflict when they're not certain of the outcome. Velsareth had convened an emergency war council within hours of the communique's arrival. I knew this because Grace had 3 separate sources among the station's support staff who kept her informed. The War Council had considered options. They had reviewed the capability disclosure. They had looked at the 409 ship contacts still visible on the long-range sensors. Then they had convened a second meeting. At the second meeting, according to Grace's sources, no one had said much of anything for a very long time. 3 strike fleets were dispatched. This was not secret. The Council announced the deployments formally as military actions within Council jurisdiction, which was a legal framing that I found almost admirable in its optimism. 3 fleets, drawn from the combined forces of the 5 largest military powers in the Council, each one significantly larger than anything Earth had officially ever fielded. They crossed the outer boundary of declared Terran space on a Tuesday morning, station time. Each fleet received the same message simultaneously, broadcast on all standard military frequencies and several non-standard ones, in each fleet's primary language. The message was brief. You are in Terran compact space. Your presence is acknowledged. You are requested to withdraw within 48 hours. There will be no second notice. No threats, no posturing, no list of consequences. Simply a statement of fact, a request, a timeline, and a clarification that the timeline would not be extended. The fleets held position. 47 hours and 51 minutes later, the lead elements of all 3 fleets reversed course and began withdrawing from Terran space. Nothing had happened to them. Nothing had approached them. No Terran ships had been visible within sensor range. But every fleet commander had received, during those 47 hours, a steady stream of technical data from their own sensors, data showing things in the surrounding space that their instruments could detect but not fully classify, readings that suggested presence without confirming form, signatures that appeared at the edge of resolution and did not resolve further. The fleet commanders were professionals. They understood what that kind of data meant. It meant there were things in that space that they could not see clearly, and that the people who put those things there wanted them to know it without showing them everything. Powerful entities are very rarely willing to start a conflict when they're not certain of the outcome. The withdrawal of the 3 fleets was the moment, I think, when the Council's political center shifted. Not the communique, not the capability disclosure, the withdrawal, because the communique could be dismissed as a bluff and the capability disclosure was a document and documents could be questioned. But 3 military forces turning around without a single exchange of fire, that was a fact. That was a thing that happened in the physical world, and it could not be reinterpreted no matter how skilled the interpreter. I was called before a full council session for the first time 3 days after the withdrawals. Not as an observer, as a representative. The invitation came through formal channels, addressed to the Terran Compact First Speaker, which was a title I had been given by the Compact's administration 48 hours after sending those 3 words. I dressed carefully that morning, not in the standard observer gray I had worn for 11 years, in the formal blue of the Terran Compact's diplomatic corps, a color I had packed in my luggage when I arrived at Vethara Prime 11 years ago and never unpacked. Paula saw me in the corridor on the way to the chamber. She looked at the jacket for a moment. "Nice color," she said. "Thank you," I said. I walked into the council chamber through the main entrance, not the observer stairs. The doors were 3 times my height. They opened automatically. I walked to the designated representative's position on the chamber floor, a position that had never, in the council's history, been occupied by a human being, and I stood there, and I looked at the 31 delegates in their tiered seats, and at Vel-Sareth in the center, and I allowed the silence to sit for exactly as long as it needed to. The chairs around me were large, built for species physically bigger than a human. I did not feel small in them. I had spent 11 years feeling small in that building. I was done with that particular feeling. Vel-Sareth opened the session. He acknowledged my presence with the formal greeting reserved for sovereign-class delegations. He said the words correctly, in the right order, with the right tone. It cost him something. I could see it in the set of his shoulders. Then he did something I had not expected. He invoked an old council protocol. Procedure 7 Delta, it was called in the human translation, the capacity evaluation. It was a provision, written into council law 200 years ago, that allowed existing member species to formally assess any new sovereign applicant before granting full voting and territorial rights. The assessment was a public proceeding, conducted in the council chamber, in which the new applicant was required to demonstrate their claimed capabilities before an independent review panel. It was, in practice, a ritual designed to allow established powers to force a newcomer to prove themselves on terms set by those powers, a test designed to produce a specific result. Vel-Sareth announced the invocation of Procedure 7 Delta with great formal precision. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said that the Terran Compact accepted the evaluation. Vel-Sareth's secondary eyelids performed a single slow blink. He had not expected acceptance. He had expected negotiation, or objection, or delay. Acceptance was the one response he had not prepared for. The evaluation will be conducted in standard fashion, he said. The applicant is to present a capable vessel for physical assessment at the station's primary docking ring within 7 days. I confirmed the timeline. The Terran vessel arrived in 5. It came out of the dark on a Thursday morning, and it came slowly, because the council station's approach corridors were not designed for anything of that size. The long-range sensors picked it up at maximum range, and for the first 20 minutes, the station's sensor operators believed they were looking at an incoming asteroid. Then the readings clarified. It was not an asteroid. It was a ship. It was shaped like a flattened disk, dark in color, with a surface that absorbed rather than reflected light. Its mass was such that the station's proximity gravity compensation systems activated automatically as it entered the outer docking approach. The station's support staff had to extend the primary docking corridor to its maximum configuration to accommodate even the smallest of its docking ports. The technical specifications were transmitted formally to the Council's review panel as required by the protocol. The review panel received the transmission. They read the first 3 pages of specifications. The evaluation was cancelled. Vel-Sareth announced the cancellation by stating, without further explanation, that the compact had satisfied the requirements of Procedure 7 Delta. He said it quickly, and moved on to the next item of business, and did not look at the gallery where Paula and Grace and Colin were sitting. Grace told me later that she had watched Counselor Maresh's face during the entire docking approach sequence. She said he had not moved at all for the last 9 minutes before the evaluation was cancelled. She said it looked like someone who had been shown the answer to a question he had been asking for a very long time, and who was not entirely pleased with the answer. Maresh had been working against us for some time. I had known this. Grace had known it. The Compact's intelligence division had confirmed it 6 years ago when they had first established access to his communications network. He had been building a coalition among the inner-ring species, working quietly, using the same kind of patient lateral movement that he probably thought of as sophisticated strategy. He was not a stupid being. His strategy was not bad, as strategies went. It just had a significant flaw, which was that it depended on human representatives not knowing about it. Drennick had come to me the week before with what he thought was a warning. He had been careful about it, hesitant, spending 5 minutes on diplomatic pleasantries before working around to the actual information. I had let him complete the whole approach before telling him, gently, that I was already aware of Maresh's coalition. Drenek had gone still for a moment. "How long?" he asked. "How long have we known?" "About 6 years. How long has Maresh been building it?" "About 8. Another silence. "You let it continue for 6 years. "We monitored it," I said. "There's a difference. We let it continue because stopping it would have required revealing that we had access to his communications, and at that point, we had not yet reached the moment where revealing things was useful." Drenek processed this. His antennae made a motion I had come to associate with something close to awe, though I was not entirely certain that was the right word for it. "Is there anything about this station," he said slowly, "that your people do not know?" I thought about it honestly. "There are probably things," I said. "We try to keep that list short." The compact's terms were presented formally to the Council on a Friday afternoon session, 11 days after the initial communiqué. I delivered them personally, standing at the representative's position on the chamber floor, reading from a prepared document that I had been involved in drafting for the previous 9 days. The terms were 5 in number. First, the immediate restoration of all colonial territories reclassified without Terran consent, including Kepler 62F, and 4 other settlements identified in the attached documentation. Second, the formal annulment of the Heritage Reserve Resolution as it applied to the Sol system, and all declared Terran space. Third, the establishment of a reparations framework compensating every observer class and pre-integration species that had paid the continuity tithe under coercive circumstances, to be funded by the member species that had most benefited from the tithe program. Fourth, a structural reform of the Council's voting system, removing the direct correlation between military capacity and voting weight, and replacing it with a system that weighted population, territorial extent, and economic contribution equally. Fifth, a new open membership protocol allowing any pre-integration species meeting basic criteria to apply for sovereign status, without requiring a 2/3 supermajority vote of existing members, which was the current rule and which had been used repeatedly to keep smaller species in permanent observer status. I read all 5 terms clearly and without embellishment. I did not say what the consequences of refusal would be. I did not need to. The ship was still in the docking corridor. The 409 contacts were still on the sensors. The 3 fleets had already gone home. When I finished reading, the chamber was quiet. Then Vel Sarath, in a voice that was as controlled as anything I had ever heard from him, asked for a recess to allow delegates to consult with their home governments. I told him the compact would allow 14 days. He accepted. The technical briefing that the compact's strategic liaison transmitted to me on the evening of the 14th day was not for general circulation. It was classified at the highest level the compact used, which meant it was encrypted in a format that would have taken the Council's best cryptographers approximately 40 years to break, if they had known it existed to try breaking. It described, in precise language, what the 409 ships were actually capable of, not the summary version that had been included in the formal communiqué, the actual version. I read it once. Then I closed the file, set my tablet down, and sat with the information for a few minutes. Then I filed a reply to the strategic liaison which said simply, "Understood. Maintain current posture. Await further instruction." The reason I am telling you about this briefing is not to describe what was in it. The reason I am telling you about it is that I sent a copy of it, fully encrypted, to a secure archive that the compact maintained outside the Council station, not because it needed to go anywhere, not because anyone had asked me to send it, but because of an old habit I had developed over 11 years of observer work. You document what you know, you record what you have, You put things somewhere that cannot be lost or altered or denied. Because the moment you need to point to something and say, this happened, and here is the evidence, you want that evidence to be somewhere it cannot be touched. Powerful entities, I had learned, had very creative memories when convenience required it. We would not need creative memories, we would have receipts. The formal negotiations over the 5 terms were conducted across 9 separate sessions over a period of 3 weeks. I attended each one. I presented each term with the same calm, factual precision I had brought to every document I had filed in 11 years of observer work. I answered questions directly. I did not embellish. I did not threaten. When council members pushed back on specific provisions, I listened to their objections fully before responding. This approach confused several of the inner ring delegates. They were experienced political operators. They knew how to handle a counterpart who argued emotionally, or one who stonewalled, or one who bargained aggressively from the first position. They had been doing this for decades. They had a repertoire. They did not have a repertoire for someone who listened to everything, acknowledged what was valid, and then explained in plain language why the overall terms were not subject to change. Colin, who attended every session and spent most of them running calculations on his handheld, told me on the evening of the 5th session that he had been analyzing the body language patterns of the inner ring delegates over the past 5 days. 3 of them have switched tactics twice already, he said. They keep trying different angles. None of them are landing. What angle are they on now? Appeals to common interest. They're trying to reframe the reform as a shared galactic stability problem. He paused. It's not a bad argument. It would be more compelling if they hadn't spent 200 years defining stability as whatever arrangement benefited them most. Noted in the record, I said, but keep watching. When they stop switching tactics, that means they've reached a decision. About what? About whether to accept the terms, I said. The switching is indecision. The stillness is conclusion. On the 7th session, 3 of the 5 inner ring delegates who had been most resistant stopped switching tactics. They went still. I watched it happen in real time and felt the same quiet certainty I had felt in the gallery when Velsoreth had first read the communiqué. Not satisfaction exactly, more like recognition. The recognition of a pattern completing itself. After the session, as the delegates were filing out, the Unworthy delegate, the one who had asked a polite question about the tithe review process years ago and had never raised it again, stopped beside me on his way to the exit. He was small, 4-limbed, with a face that did not make expressions in any way I had learned to read. But he stopped, and he stood there for a moment. Then he said, in the careful, considered way of someone who had been thinking about a sentence for a very long time, the question I asked about the Secretariat review process, the one that was not answered. I remember it, I said. Will the new structure address it? I thought about the 4th term, the structural reform, the removal of the direct correlation between military capacity and voting weight. Yes, I said, it will. He stood there for another moment. Then he moved on without another word. As I walked back toward the main doors, one of the outer ring delegates, a small, 4-limbed being from a species I knew had paid more than they could afford in tithe assessments over the past decade, called out a single word in their own language. I did not speak that language, but Grace, in the gallery above, heard it and told me later what it meant. It meant finally. It did not happen all at once. Nothing real ever does. The first species to break from the council's position were 3 of the outer ring members. They sent quiet messages, not public statements, not dramatic defections, just careful, private communications routed through their ambassadors to the Terran Compact's newly established diplomatic office on Vethara Prime. The messages said different things in different language, but they all carried the same meaning. We support the proposed terms. I received each message at my desk. I read each one carefully. Then I filed them in the same place I filed everything. By the 6th day of the 14-day recess, 9 species had sent similar messages. By the 10th day, 16. The inner-ring species took longer. They had more to lose from the structural reform proposal, and they were not people who moved quickly toward decisions that cost them something. But they were also not people who were blind to mathematical reality. The mathematics were straightforward. Earth's 5 terms, if implemented, would cost the inner-ring species some portion of the procedural advantages they had accumulated over 2 centuries. That was real. But refusing those terms would require them to do something about the 409 ships, and the installations, and the population figures, and the drive systems they could not classify. And doing something about those things required first knowing what those things actually were in their entirety, not just the portion disclosed in the communiqué. And they did not know. And they were not willing to find out in a way that could not be undone. The calculation took 11 days. On the 12th day, Velsareth called a full council session. I dressed again in the compact blue. Paula came with me. Grace and Colin sat in the gallery, but they were not in the observer section. The station's administration had, without any particular announcement, reclassified the Terran gallery from observer to compact delegation. New placard, same chairs. The difference was everything. The vote on the first term, restoration of reclassified colonial territories, went 28-3 in favor. The 3 against were the species who had directly benefited most from the specific reclassifications in question. Their opposition was expected and was noted in the record without altering the outcome. The vote on the Heritage Reserve annulment went 31-0. That was the one I watched most carefully. 31-0, including the 3 who had just voted against the first term, including Velsareth, who cast his vote with the same deliberate slowness he brought to everything, and who did not look at the representative's position on the floor where I sat. After the Heritage Reserve vote, there was a pause in the session. Not a formal recess, just a moment where the normal momentum of the proceedings seemed to slow, as though the chamber itself needed to catch its breath. I looked at my tablet. There was a small voting console embedded in the representative's desk. It had been active for the entire session, registering my presence, waiting for a moment when it would be needed. The 4th vote, the structural reform of the voting system, was the difficult one. It passed 24-7. The 7 who voted against were from the inner ring, but it passed. At the conclusion of the structural reform vote, the session clerk updated the council's voting registry in real time. Every delegate's voting weight was recalculated under the new formula. The results appeared on the floor's central display, visible to everyone. Earth's new voting weight, under the formula that weighted population, territory, and economic contribution equally, placed the Terran Compact in the 7th position out of 32 member species. Not first, not dominant, 7th. I had been involved in the drafting of the terms. I had read those numbers before they were formally presented. But there is a difference between reading numbers in a document and seeing them appear on a public display in the council chamber of the most powerful interstellar body in explored space. I pressed the vote key for the first time. It was a small physical sensation. The console registered a soft click. The display updated. Terran Compact, 1 vote cast. 11 years of silence, and then a click. I had not expected to feel much. I had been in that chamber through hundreds of sessions, through dozens of votes, through debates and decisions that reshaped the lives of billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. I had watched it all from behind a clarity screen without being able to participate in any of it. The click was quiet, but it was mine. The 5th term, the new open membership protocol, passed 26-6. The moment it passed, there were already 17 pre-integration species eligible to begin applications under the new rules. The station's observer galleries held representatives from 11 of them. I did not look up at those galleries during the vote, but I was aware of them. I was aware of 12 years of watching, learning, waiting. 11 years in my case, longer in others. After the session ended, as delegates were leaving the chamber and the cleaning drones were beginning their work, Velsareth passed me in the corridor near the main exit. He was alone. His advisors were several meters behind him. He walked with the same deliberate weight he always had, the same movement that said the universe could wait. But something in the quality of that weight was different. Not diminished. I don't think he was capable of diminished, but changed. He stopped when he reached me. I stopped. We stood in the corridor for a moment. The advisors behind him had halted a discreet distance away. The cleaning drones continued their work in the chamber behind us. Somewhere down the corridor, voices were moving through the station's normal, continuing business. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something, not in his formal council voice, in a quieter register, the kind of voice you use when you are not performing for anyone. He said, "I underestimated your world." It was not an apology. It was not quite an acknowledgement. It was something more precise than either, a statement of observed fact from a being who dealt in power and had just encountered a data point that did not fit his existing model. I looked at him for a moment. "Most people do," I said. "It's understandable. We work quite hard to make it easy." He held my gaze for a beat longer. Then he gave a small, formal inclination of his head, not the deep bow of formal ceremony, but something smaller and, I thought, more genuine, and walked on. His advisors followed. I stood in the corridor for a moment longer, then continued to my office. I had a report to file. That night, alone at my desk with the station quiet around me, I composed the most personal message I had sent home in 11 years. Not a formal report, not a procedural summary, something closer to a letter. I described the session. I described the votes. I described the corridor with Velsareth. I described the click of the voting key. At the end of it, I found myself writing about the observers, about the delegates in the upper galleries, from species who had been watching for years and decades, filing things away, learning the shape of a galaxy that had not yet decided to include them. I thought about what they had seen today. Not a conquest, not a display of force for its own sake. Something that was, when you looked at it clearly, simply a correction, a set of rules being brought closer to what they should have been. I thought about what it would look like to someone sitting in a gallery, watching. I thought about what it had looked like to me 11 years ago when I sat in that gallery for the first time. A young diplomat from a quiet world, watching the powerful move the world around and thinking, we are going to have to do something about this eventually. Not yet, but eventually. Then I finished the letter, and at the very end, I typed the only message I needed to send to Director Yates. One word. Done. I sent it. Then I sat back in my chair and looked out the window at the station's outer ring, at the cargo ships moving in their slow, orderly lines, carrying goods between species, maintaining the commerce that kept the galactic community running. The same ships I had watched from the same window for 11 years. They looked the same, but the space they were moving through was different now. Not dramatically different, not unrecognizable, just corrected, adjusted by a small number of degrees, the way a compass is adjusted when you discover the reading was off. Sometimes that is all it takes. Drenek came by later that evening. He brought something from his homeworld, a drink, warm and faintly sweet, served in a flat bowl the way his people preferred. He set a bowl in front of me and kept one for himself and sat across the desk. We did not say anything for a while. That was comfortable. It had always been comfortable with Drenek. Do you know what the hardest part was? I said eventually. Tell me, he said. The banquet, I said. Not the tithe, not Kepler 62F, the banquet. He was quiet for a moment, because of what they did. Because of what I didn't do, I said. Every time someone did something like that, I filed it away. I noted it. I told myself it was part of the process, and it was, but I paused. There were moments. Yes, Drennick said. The hardest part of patience, I said, is not the waiting. It's convincing yourself in the middle of the wait that the waiting is worth it. Drennick held his bowl in both hands and looked at the surface of the liquid. Was it, he said, worth it? I thought about 11,000 people on a green world who woke up this morning on a Terran colony. I thought about 17 pre-integration species who were already preparing their membership applications under a protocol that had not existed yesterday. I thought about the click of the voting key. Yes, I said. He drank, I drank. Outside the window, the cargo ships continued their slow orbits, and somewhere in the long-range sensor network, 409 vessels maintained their positions across 409 star systems, patient as they had been trained to be, waiting for an order that would now, hopefully, never need to come. In the upper galleries of the council chamber, the observer delegations had returned to their seats for the next session. Different species, different names, different worlds, same chairs, same clarity screen, same view of the chamber floor below. They were watching. They were learning. They were filing things away. I know, because that is what you do when the galaxy has not yet decided to take you seriously. You watch everything. You miss nothing. You say very little. And you wait for the moment when silence becomes the most powerful statement you have ever made. We found that moment. Others will find theirs. The morning after the final vote, I woke early and walked to the gallery before anyone else arrived. The chamber below was empty and dark. The cleaning drones finished with their work from the previous evening. I sat in the chair I had occupied for 11 years, in the seat that now carried a different designation above the door, and I looked at the floor below. There is something about a room when it is empty that tells you what it actually is. In session, the council chamber was power made physical, a space designed to remind you of exactly where you stood. Empty, it was just a room. A very large room with good acoustics and expensive flooring, but a room. The power was not in the space. The power was in who was allowed to use it and how and toward what end. We had changed the how. We had changed the toward what end. The space itself had not changed at all. Same stone, same tiers, same central display. I found that thought settling, in a way I had not expected. Paula came in 40 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee again. She handed me one and sat in the chair beside me. Maresh resigned his seat last night, she said. I heard, I said. He cited health reasons. Of course he did. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor below. His coalition dissolved before the final vote. 3 of the species he had approached came to us directly and told us about the approach. Grace mentioned that. They also provided documentation, Paula said. Written records of the conversations, very thorough. I looked at her. Send copies to the council's ethics office. Don't make it public, just file it. Paula nodded, already done. We sat with our coffee in the gallery that had been our home for the better part of a decade. The early light from the station's outer ring was coming through the transparency at a low angle, laying long pale rectangles across the floor below. It was, I thought, a nicer room than it had any right to be, given everything that had happened in it. Grace arrived next, then Colin, and for a few minutes the 4 of us just sat in the gallery together, in the quiet before the day's business began, not speaking. There was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said, or that would not eventually be said in a report. This was something different. This was the particular silence of people who have been through something together and are sitting on the other side of it. Then Colin's handheld chirped. He looked at it. First membership application under the new protocol, he said. Filed this morning at 400 station time. Which species? Grace asked. He read from the screen. The Reventhi. They've been in observer status for 23 years. 23 years. I thought about that. I thought about whoever had been sitting in their gallery for 23 years, watching the sessions, filing the reports, waiting. Begin the formal review process, I said. Standard procedure, timely response. Let them know their application has been received and is under active consideration. Colin made a note. There are 16 others pending. We'll work through them, I said, one at a time properly. The regular session that morning was the most ordinary session I had attended in 11 years. Resource discussions, a minor boundary clarification, a procedural vote on meeting schedules, the kind of business that made up 90% of what the council actually did, underneath all the power and ceremony and historical weight. I sat on the chamber floor and voted on each item. My votes were not decisive. That was not the point. The point was that they were counted, that they existed in the record. That when the session transcript was filed and archived, and added to the 200 years of council records kept on the station's central database, the Terran Compact's position on each question would be part of that record. We would not be removed from the record. We would not be an abstention. We would be there. After the session, a young observer from one of the pre-integration delegations was waiting in the corridor outside the chamber. I had seen this person before. They sat in one of the outer galleries, a small being with pale features and the careful stillness of someone who had learned, in whatever gallery they came from, to watch without being noticed. They were holding a small datapad. They looked like they had been working up to something for a while. First speaker Calloway, they said. Their translation collar was good, clear, and nearly accent neutral. Yes, I said. They held out the datapad. On it was a document, a formal information request, routed through the Observer Liaison Office, asking for guidance on the new membership application process. It was perfectly correct procedurally, properly filed, properly formatted. My people would like to begin, they said. I took the datapad. I read the first page. I looked at the name of their world, which was a string of sounds that did not translate directly into any human language, but which the colony's linguists had rendered as something close to the place where the long rains come. I thought about a planet somewhere in the dark, where people had been watching and waiting and wondering for however long they had been wondering, and had sent this person here to ask a question. Tell your people, I said, that we will send them the full application package within 48 hours, and that there is a dedicated liaison available to assist with any questions during the process. The young observer looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized. Not gratitude, quite. Something more complex than that. The expression of someone who had been expecting to be given a reason to wait and had not been given one. Thank you, they said. They left. I stood in the corridor for a moment with the datapad in my hand. Then I handed it to Paula, who had been walking 3 steps behind me through the entire exchange. Start the package, I said. Already on it, she said. Drennick found me that evening not in the gallery, but in the small garden space on the station's inner ring. It was one of the station's older areas, a circular room with soil and actual growing things in raised beds, maintained by the station's botanical division. Most council members walked past it without stopping. I came there sometimes when I needed to think without walls. He sat on the bench beside me, and for a while we just watched a small water feature move through its cycle. You knew from the beginning, he said eventually, what they would eventually do. Not exactly when, I said, just that they would. How? I thought about how to explain it. Power, I said slowly, tends to make certain kinds of mistakes, not because powerful entities are foolish, most of them are not, but because power over time creates a particular kind of vision, a way of looking at everything through the lens of what you have and what you can do, and the longer you look at the world through that lens, the harder it becomes to see anything that doesn't fit the lens. And Earth. Earth has spent a very long time learning to see without a lens, I said. We have a particular history. We have been wrong about ourselves and about others in ways that cost us enormously. We learned eventually to be suspicious of certainty, to assume we were missing something, to keep looking. I paused. It's not a comfortable way to live, but it makes you very hard to underestimate correctly. Drenek was quiet for a moment, watching the water. What happens now, he said, to the council? The council continues, I said,